Hey everybody, it's Carm here. I'm back again to do another artist spotlight. Another favorite that I've been meaning to get around to for quite some years. Just did Enya's video earlier today, although you're seeing this at a much at a different time. This is partly inspired, kind of got me going finally, by a video that Fred had done recently, Big Star 1000. He's brought back his Gimme 10 series. You know, some wonderful stuff shown there. Really bringing me back with a lot of these artists and titles. And he did one on minimalism recently, which is always had a special place in my own heart and consciousness for many years. And without giving away too much of what he was featuring, some of the artists that he featured are among my all-time favorites in the world, regardless of the genre, including this one featuring here, which I was waiting for him. I'm like, is he going to show this one? Is he going to show this one? And of course, when he did, I thought, of course, it's hard to leave him off there. And that's the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, born 1935, right around roughly the same time as a lot of the other, what's considered the pioneers of minimalist music in the West. That style and approach to modern classical music. Of course, a different background here is they're mostly American, but again the same generation, and you could hear some similar touch points and characteristics, but of course they're all as distinctive as anyone else. But yeah, it was very inspiring to see Fred show that among the others, and meeting too for years. Arvo Pärt, my own introduction to him was from around 90. It's a little fuzzy as to whether it's late 94 or early 95, but it was an episode of Music from the Hearts of Space, which I'd been an avid listener to for a while, along with Starstreams, of course. And they did an entire hour-long feature on music of Arvo Pärt, which up to that point, most of what I'd heard featured was, the kind of the basic, the electronic space music. But of course I found, upon listening to it, and being so drawn in right away, I think that's kind of the theme of the show, or what Stephen Hill would refer to it as, slow music for fast times. And I found that was definitely what Arvo Pärt's music was. Very different in it being all acoustic and much of it vocal. You could say it's religious music, but it's religious music that could appeal to the secular, as well. Part of I believe, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and in the music, in the lyrics, the Psalms, a lot of that's explicitly stated. But I believe whatever you're into, whatever your orientation, music-wise, spiritually, religious, you could find something in there if you appreciate slower, more contemplative music. Now, Arvo himself had started off, as a very young man, as a composer, played piano, and exploring a lot of different styles. His early music, which I didn't hear till some years later, is quite different than what he's most known for, which is that quieter, contemplative, minimalist approach. Again, very much in his own way. Probably something closer to someone like Webern, that kind of experimental, dissonant, thorny, angular, that sort of thing. But at some point, I believe it was in the mid-70s, where there was a period, a long gap, where I'm not sure if it was that he wasn't composing music, at least he wasn't putting it out publicly. But in around 1976, after a lot of experimenting and soul searching, he came out with a very different style, something very much his own. He had dubbed tintinnabule, I believe, which I believe roughly translates to bell-like. Not just the sound and tone and timbres of bells, but the relationship between the tones of when you're hearing bells, the kind of gradual decay in the pacing, which you would hear a bell played at, whether it's a church bell being tolled or just just the general interrelationship of those sounds. And it was something really new, and I think it took a long time, fairly for the larger public to appreciate, when I think something of that kind of music became more, if not in vogue, more appreciated, because it was realized how much it was needed in society. As things get faster and more complex, that kind of music, I think, is desired, maybe whether one really consciously realizes it or not. He had said something to the effect himself, Arvo Pärt, that the complex and the multifaceted only confuses me, and I must look for unity. And I've realized it's enough when a single note can be beautifully played, and that's evident in so much of his music. And I just have a short stack here. I have more, but I wanted to show just some, I'd say, representative highlights of what I've heard over these nearly 30 years or so. I did feature this early album, Tabula Rasa, in a video, given it more attention. This is recorded between 1977 and 1983, I believe, 1984. And I won't say too much here, other than it was definitely very striking for its time, and even from the first time I heard it. And a lot of his stuff up until that point was featured on Hearts of Space, beautifully sequenced, including some pieces from here, Fratres, which there's two versions, violin and piano, as well as for 12 cellists. Very slow, brooding, haunting. You could hear some of that, more of a thorny quality of the earlier music, but stripped down to its barest essentials. And of course the larger piece, Tabula Rasa, which makes a great deal of use of silence, and really the whole sense of time is kind of thrown out the window in a sense. It's timeless in many different ways. What we think of as timeless is being beyond an identifiable period, which you would ascribe it to, but also just the very notion of time. And I think that's something that runs throughout his music and always has. There's a shorter piece, 5 minutes, called Cantus in Memory of Benjamin Britten, mostly strings, which I think was a theme to run throughout his catalog too. These shorter string-laden pieces, which have kind of an elegiac quality, but also extremely emotional, making the most of the strings' tonal range, emotional range, just the way they're stretched and twisted and just weave together. It's so beautiful, and it's a quiet intensity, which so much of his music has. But as an introduction, I mean, this is about as good as anything else. It's obvious. So, starting here with Tabula Rasa. And this one came out in '84. Next up, Miserere from 1991, recorded mostly in 1990. I believe this is the second album I ever picked up by him. I'll say too, when I first started looking for his music, of course it was before, Amazon or, shopping online, at least long before I did. And, there was mail order and everything, but, you had to go to the shops and just investigate. And the local record shops, none of them had his music at all at that time, back in '95, but Circuit City did. And in fact, they had 3 or 4 of his CDs, and that's where I started my collection. So can't discount those kinds of places entirely, even though I think nowadays comparable stores don't really carry CDs anymore. But anyhow, that's where I started finding his music, was in Circuit City, which actually was adjacent from Coconuts, which was like the record store in the early days for me. But yeah, Miserere recorded in 1990. I think you hear his style, developing further from that early, tintabule, which I can never really pronounce. But this is where, again, that more sparse approach is wedded along with a more grandeur, you could say, but not necessarily grandiose, where it's over the top, where it sounds like it's too much coming at you. The dynamic range, and he uses a lot of choir as well as mixed instrumentation. You hear those, those quieter passages, those dynamics, along with an almost bombast coming at you, but it leads you in gently, and just continually rises and swells as you go along. So it's kind of mindful of the journey it's taking you on. It's not too abrupt, which I think is a hallmark of his music for the most part. The dynamics get wider, the emotions get more intense, but again, it's a quiet, contemplative intensity. So much just kind of rumbling under the surface that you're just, you just have to wait for it. Once it comes at you, it's like it's onto a new place. So that, the title cut is very long and goes through those various moods and feelings. Paul Hilliard conducting the Hilliard Ensemble, well-known vocal group. It's been around for decades. I think they might not be performing anymore, but they were quite prominent at the time. Mentioning another thing, when I found these were on ECM New Series, specifically the classical branch of the label, I was even more thrilled because I was getting hugely into the label around that time, by the mid-90s. And the next piece, Festina Lente, bears resemblance to that cantus in memory of Benjamin Britten. Strings, short piece, but so much packed in that piece. Not in terms of density of notes, but just the emotions. Just the way it swells and builds is just hits you right in the. It's almost like it has the visceral feeling of like a heart being wrung out, but not in a way that's off-putting. But it's like you want to go there somehow, and he leads you there without it sounding too, without being too much, at least for me anyway. And Sarah Was 90 Years Old, another longer piece, which dates back to 1976. Looks like it was revised in 1990. Extremely sparse. It has Pierre Favre on percussion, well-known jazz improv, really indefinable player, which is my own introduction to him too on this album, along with Christopher Bowers Broadbent on organ, who's played a part in quite a few of Arvo's albums, as well as some members of the Hilliard Ensemble with choir. It starts off with the percussion, very slow, very gradual, lots of long silences. So if you don't have much patience for silence, where their silences are longer than the music, it could be more challenging, but it's worth it if you want to give that a try. Some nice pictures in here too. There's Pierre on the couple of smaller drums there. There he is working with Arvo, commiserating, figuring out probably the time and the timbre and all. And that piece, gradually builds up to where there's the members of the choir come in. Even the few members of, even like 3 or 4 singers, can sound like a huge chorus, along with the organ, which just gives it that, that much more intensity. See more members of the choir and the chamber group. The colors of the instruments too, the way they're used, are very particular to the way Arvo composes and arranges. But, just beautiful. Again, hearing those contrasts of different emotions, pacings, dynamics is so strongly felt on here, and it's another good introduction. Next up was the very first album I actually bought of his at that Circuit City back there in 1995, from 1993, to Deum. And speaking of Enya before, she was always a wintertime artist. From hearing him in the wintertime and buying this album, which is very wintry, which again, of course, is why I'm featuring it now in July. But it made such an impression on me right away. Having this be the kind of the first full statement I'm hearing from him. Already some years into his own recording career and output. Yeah, recorded in January 1993 in Finland, in Tonu Tormis. I believe he's the conductor. Or no, I'm sorry, Tonu Kaljuste. Tonu Kaljuste is a long-standing conductor. He was collaborated with Arvo for many, many years, and featured in so many of his albums. And you can see here the lyrics, the Psalms, religious text, which is another case of whatever they're singing, you could just, even not understanding the words, you get the feeling and the emotions here. Incredible space that they're in a church sanctuary. In a sense, is a picture of the music too, the solemnity to it. I'd say on here the dynamics of silent to intense, almost cacophony at times, without it being so intrusive that it's bothersome, but it's perfect. Just the again, that intensity going between the quiet and at times bombastic. It fits so well. There's Arvo himself overseeing the orchestra. This, I love these here. I believe that's Manfred Eicher, along with Arvo, who, of course, the aesthetics of the label is just perfect. It's a perfect mating, of minds and views about music, I think. Views about what it does, to your soul, and the emotional range, just runs through, the whole ECM catalog, and that would in part culminate, through Arvo Pärt. It's just so fitting. And it was years before I really fully realized that for myself. Hearing so many other things. There's Tonu Kaljuste, the conductor. I love this here with the, pardon my squeaky chair, with the snow here in the forest land. Fitting too, because again, it was the dead of winter when I first heard his music overall, bought this album, and seeing this and poring over the pictures while listening, it was just, it's all perfect for that time. So this is my first full introduction to him, and just still powerful. It's powerful now, almost 30 years later, as at the time. Wow, this next one, Alina. This is one that Fred had given some special commendation to in his video, and throughout life I've had probably 3,000 albums in different forms in my collection. I've heard many overall, and in nearing 50 years of life, this is still one of my very favorite albums I've ever heard and may ever hear, honestly. And I can't believe it's taken this long to even talk about this album. I don't know if I have featured it before or made a passing mention of it, but it's just, I can't even, it's something you want to give its own video, but I couldn't do it justice, probably as I'm not doing any of this justice. But this is so powerful in its starkness. It's an older piece. I believe this is one of the first pieces when he kind of came back to this newer style in the mid-70s. What he first came with was For Alina, which is a solo piano piece. Again, alluding to that bell-like quality, or really demonstrating that bell-like quality, that tintinnabulae of solo piano. Very stark, crystalline. I don't think I've ever heard contemplativeness and an underlying tension wedded so closely yet sounding so symbiotic, where you can't really tell the difference between them. It's just perfect on that piece. Perfect. In Spiegel and Spiegel, which I'm forgetting the translation of that. I think it's mirror in mirror or mirror within mirror, which is perfect. There's 3 versions on here. 2 of them performed by Vladimir Spivakov on violin and Sergei Bezrodny on piano. And there's also Alexander Malter on piano, who does for Alina, also playing on Spiegel and Spiegel, along with Dietmar Schwalke on violoncello. And fascinating hearing those versions, so similar yet timbrally, going between the cello and then in violin, demonstrates something else. As I was listening to this, really over the years, but the last time, it brought to mind a Richard Avedon documentary I'd watched probably around this time, actually, in the mid-90s for the first time. And he was the photographer, and he was speaking about one of the great joys in life is watching light move and change, and a cloud crossing the sun, and how much you could learn about life by just observing. And light can teach us so much, the natural light. And this illustrates that as much as anything else I've ever heard. It's the very embodiment of watching light slowly and gradually change, and everything you could observe within it. I don't know what more I could say about this, but it's just one of the great albums, great moments. Suffice to say, it's my all-time favorite album of his. But it's an incredible statement, and there's no vocals or choir, so it's his most stripped-down album that I've heard. And it could be as well of an introduction as anything else. Maybe not the most representative as far as his sound with the larger groups, but it's powerful beyond words. Which again, I'm doing it no justice, but yeah, for Alina, just incredible. Next up, this was from Alina was from 1999, recorded in 1995, and this is from kind of went out of sequence here, somewhat. 1998, recorded in 1997, so maybe not. Canon Pokajanen, not quite sure pronounce that. I believe this translates to the bells, or it's in a different way than tintinnabuli. Not quite sure. This, by contrast, though, is all choir, all vocal, and it's a double CD set. And this one, as you might expect, has, being that it's all choir, all voices, singing the various text, or religious text, has the most kind of devotional, liturgical, both in literal sense as well as the tone overall. You imagine being in a church sanctuary of some kind, with the candles and incense and stained glass, and again, speaking of the light before, the light moving and changing within the space, in the extreme dynamics and range of emotion. Solemn, but there's joy in it as well. I think depending on what you're bringing to it as a listener as well, according to your own mood at the time. But for a taste of his purely vocal work, this is a very good place to turn to. It has a kind of a interesting rhythmic quality too, between the vocals at times, like a kind of call and response, which makes it sound even more ancient in a way, like almost maybe not primordial, but where you're kind of going back to the roots, the earliest music, vocal music coming through time, of that sort. So Another very powerful statement. And next up, jumping ahead a couple of years to 2002, Orient Occident. This one is the first one where you're hearing what may have been influences from his earlier years. Not quite as contemplative, but it has a certain almost foreboding urgency is how I would describe it. In the strings, the way they come in. He actually did soundtracks early on in his life, and I think at different times, his music has been used in a lot of different mediums. I know I'd seen some documentaries in which some of his music was used, and it took me a moment to realize, oh, that's him, and it's perfect somehow, whatever the footage may have been. But on here, it sounds like something that's really on its own. You could almost imagine kind of a mystery, maybe a mystery movie, or there's a sense of, that kind of foreboding, a kind of lurking in the shadows, which you don't really get with his music as much. Again, it's that more kind of solemn, contemplative feel, but this has something a little different in the mood. In the strings, the way it has a certain elasticity, the phrasing, which is a little different than I'd heard previously. But it was really nice, revisiting and reminding oneself how versatile he's always been, because it's that accumulation of everything he had gone through. Musically, you hear some of it seeping a little bit more into his modern works, even beyond this newer style, this slower contemplative style. But yeah, for another side of that, of what he would do, this is very well worth hearing. Next up from 2005, Lamentate, or Lament. I'd say this is among my favorite works of his. Again, for bringing something a little different to what I'd heard previously. The first piece, Da Passem Domini, is the Hilliard Ensemble, the vocal group again. This one has a kind of again, that kind of emotions being wrung out of you very gradually is how it feels. Almost like it's hesitant, it's pulling back and then it's going forward again and pulling back, then pulling the emotions forth again. Almost as like the voices are sort of dripping out of them and they're pulling back, and then, but there's always a little bit of there's hesitation, but it's also immensely expressive, and in a way that you would expect really from Arvo, with that whole style and approach. And the piece overall, Lamentate, has some of the widest dynamics and really emotions. He speaks of lamenting in here, not just lamenting those who have passed, but lamenting ourselves even as we're living, through the things we live through in the world, the complexity and the problems that humanity is fraught with all through the ages, of course, especially now. But you hear, sometimes outright anger in the piece, or the kind of banging and crashing. But there's also a kind of letting go and a resignation that, well, all we can do is for the time being let it go and just experience this and hope to get through it better, is how I interpret it. It's also dedicated and inspired by this incredible piece here. Can you see that perspective? Here's all the people, the orchestra and the audience, and this sculpture by Anish Kapoor. Miserere, I believe it's called. Marcias by Anish Kapoor. Yeah, speaking about what that meant to him, seeing that. I hope this is coming through if you want to pause that. These are Arvo's own notes here. But just imagining to walking into that space and seeing that there, and hearing the music in that space, all coming together with the visual, just unbelievable. The artist himself. He's now, I believe he's going on 89 years old. Really hasn't changed much throughout the years, though. He's aged, still, relatively youthful, and still active, and still creative. And at this point, which is nearly 20 years ago now. So, Lamentate, another beautiful statement and perspective. This next one here is, I'd say, the most difficult of all his albums I've heard, for me personally, but also really the most fascinating. The symphonies, and you see where they're dated from, going back to from the 60s to nearly the present. Back at that time when he was finding his way stylistically, how he wanted to express himself in music, just trying all sorts of things. Sounding very natural. It didn't sound like he was merely pasting on styles. It was really a real expression, and really shocking when I first heard it, knowing what the core of his work that I was most familiar with. There he is there, circa 1962. He's a very young man, and you could kind of hear the thread between the three symphonies, 64, 66, 71. Again, going back to that kind of more difficult, angular, at times dissonant, but also you could hear traditional classical forms, that you might have heard with someone like Beethoven, but again, kind of filter through his own approach that he was still finding for himself, as well as little seeds of what was to come later, in the 70s. You could hear that in the later piece from 71, Symphony Number 3. But again, there's also those moments of bombast, and that was different than what came later. It came right at you, very starkly and sharply. These are examples now of the music where there is a kind of juddering, eruptive thing where it's not as gradual. It takes if you jump scare easily, some of this could really get you, which is different than a lot of his other music. But it's very much worth hearing for that cumulative journey that he'd gone through. And in the final piece, the Fourth Symphony from 2008, you can hear that thread running from those first three symphonies, all those years before. And he's also allowing the intervening music influences and aesthetics to come through, but just little by little it feels. He's still trying to keep that thread, establish that thread, and hold it from the first three symphonies to the fourth. But he's letting you know that, again, this is all my interpretation, that the intervening music has come through as well. He's trying to find that kind of balancing act between those, the earliest, more difficult stuff, and what was to come. And does it beautifully, but again, it's a challenge. So just know what you're in for. Wouldn't make this a good, if you want to be introduced to his music. If you're coming from a more, more avant-garde, for lack of a better term, more difficult approaches to expression, this would be a good introduction. But if you're more into the Alina and Tabula Rasa, might be, get into this a little bit later. But it's all there. The symphonies. And finally, here is his most recent album, Tractus, from 2023, recorded in 22. In a sense, it almost sounds like, I'm repeating myself here, but a kind of a culmination of, you hear bits and pieces of those various symphonies, as well as so much he had done ever since then. If not, maybe something of a summation or distillation, but also indications that he's trying to find new, maybe not so much new approaches, but new tones, new ways of using tone and texture and harmony, which he has a very particular way of approaching it and expressing it. There he is, there now, late 80s. Again, still very creative. Kind of like he's looking to the heavens, which, his music has always had that quality. Yearning, searching, longing, which that's something that's, I think, runs through mostly everything I've heard of his in one way or another. There's Tanu Kalgiste, long-standing collaborator for all this time, still with him and still aiding him in expressing these feelings and emotions and textures. With the orchestra. Just a beautiful work. I was really looking forward to this too, because on ECM has a channel on YouTube, and they had little teasers for this album, and I had no idea about it, so I was thrilled. These are usually released about a month before in Europe, before coming out in the States. But I couldn't wait until it came out. The maestro himself, and just gorgeous. And again, as I said with Enya's video, I hope of course this came out much more recently, but I hope it isn't a final statement. But if it were to be, it would be fitting, either way. But it's a testament to an incredible life of music, and some of the deepest expression I've ever heard on albums, and it stands the test of time in so many ways, and so strikes me as powerfully as it did almost 30 years ago. So Arvo Pärt, another artist very worth exploring and exploring further if you're already familiar. So wanted to do that and see what comes next, as always. Thank you all for watching, and until the next one. Peace, love, and joy.